There are two films about Amy Winehouse. One was made with the family's blessing. They let the crew film in her house. One was made without it. One got 38% on Rotten Tomatoes. One won an Oscar. And the reason for that difference is a story about who controls the truth when someone is no longer alive to tell it themselves. But to understand what happened when Back to Black, the 2024 biopic directed by Sam Taylor Johnson, collided with the audience that had been formed by Asif Kapadia's 2015 documentary Amy, you need to understand what those two films were actually trying to do, because they were not trying to do the same thing, they were trying to do opposite things, and the collision between them was not accidental. Kapadia's documentary had been made between 2013 and 2015. It had taken 2 years to assemble, 2 years of interviews with the people who had actually known Amy, of archive footage gathered from friends and family members and journalists and musicians, of home videos and private recordings, and the gradual accumulation of a picture that was, by the time it was finished, the most complete account of Amy Winehouse's life that had ever existed. It had been made without the cooperation of Mitch Winehouse. He had refused to participate. He had, in the years before the documentary was released, made his displeasure with its direction known through his representatives. He had seen a cut of it and objected to what he saw. The film was released in July 2015. It won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. It was praised by critics with a consistency and a fervor that is rare in documentary filmmaking, a 95% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, reviews that described it as devastating and essential, and the definitive account of one of the most significant artists of the century. What it showed, with the evidence of Amy's own words and the testimony of the people who had loved her, was a picture of a woman who had been failed by the industry, by the press, by the men in her life, and by some of the people who were supposed to be protecting her. Mitch Winehouse had been depicted in Amy as someone who had prioritized his own interests during his daughter's most vulnerable period. The film had included footage of him saying she did not need to go to rehab at a time when the people around her were desperately trying to get her into treatment. It had shown him bringing a film crew to follow Amy during a Caribbean retreat that had been arranged specifically to help her recover in private. It had presented, through accumulation rather than argument, a portrait of a father who had not always put his daughter first. Mitch had denied this characterization vigorously and consistently. He had said the documentary had been edited selectively. He had said the rehab footage was missing a crucial qualification, that he had been talking about a specific moment, not a general principle. He had said Kapadia had made a film that was not fair to him and that did not represent the reality of his relationship with his daughter. He had written a memoir. He had given interviews. He had spent years pushing back against a narrative that he believed was unjust. There is a commercial logic to authorized biopics that is worth understanding. The estate of a deceased artist controls the music, the songs, the recordings, the right to use them in any film. An unauthorized biopic cannot use the actual music. It can show characters singing or playing, but it cannot put Amy's voice on the soundtrack. For a film about one of the greatest singers of her generation, this is not a small constraint. It is the difference between a film that can immerse the audience in the music and a film that can only gesture toward it. The authorization, in other words, was a transaction. The estate got creative influence, not formal control, as Taylor Johnson was careful to establish, but the influence that comes from being the people who decide whether the actual music is in the film or not. And the film got the music. The extraordinary thing about Back to Black, the thing that Marisa Abella's performance was in service of, was the ability to use Amy's own recordings, to let her voice fill the scenes where she was supposed to be at her best. The question was what the transaction had cost, and the answer, according to the critics and the audiences and the Rotten Tomatoes score, was the truth.
And then, in 2018, the Winehouse estate signed a deal for a biopic. The film that emerged from that deal, Back to Black, written by Matt Greenhall and directed by Sam Taylor Johnson, was authorized. The estate had approved it. Mitch had approved it. The crew had been allowed to film in Amy's former home in Camden. The family had met with Taylor Johnson before production began, and while the director was careful to say publicly that the family had no creative control, that they could not change things, that if they could, she would not have done it, the evidence on screen told a more complicated story. In Back to Black, Mitch Winehouse, played by Eddie Marsan, is a loving, occasionally overbearing, but fundamentally devoted father. He is shown supporting Amy through her struggles, trying to get her help, leaving everything to accompany her to rehabilitation. The film does not show him saying she does not need to go to rehab. It does not address his own singing career or the questions about whether he had capitalized on his daughter's fame. It presents him in the most generous possible light, which is either a function of the decision to tell the story from Amy's perspective, she loved her father and from her perspective he was a loving father, or a function of the access that the estate's authorization had required.
The critics noticed immediately. One review described Back to Black as the Mitch Winehouse Show, noting that he was given significant screen time and a notably sympathetic portrayal from the opening scene. Multiple reviewers pointed to the gap between what the film showed and what the documentary had shown, and drew the obvious conclusion about what authorization had purchased. The film also sanitized Blake Fielder Civil. The man who had admitted introducing Amy to heroin was presented in Back to Black as a charming, troubled, romantic figure, the great love of her life, depicted with the warmth that the Back to Black album itself extended to him, but without the full context of what that relationship had contained. The scene in which he introduces her to hard drugs, one of the most documented and consequential moments of her story, was not in the film. Taylor Johnson defended these choices with a consistency and a clarity that was, in its way, impressive. She said she had decided to tell the story from Amy's perspective. She said Amy had looked at Blake the way the world looked at him. She said Amy had loved him. She said the film had to be filtered through the lens of love, because that was the truth of Amy's experience. She was not wrong about any of this exactly. Amy had loved Blake. Amy had loved her father. From inside those relationships, they looked different than they looked from outside. The film was making a genuine artistic argument. The argument was not accepted. There was a particular cruelty in the situation that Marisa Abela found herself in. She had done something genuinely extraordinary. She had taken on the most scrutinized role in British film that year, playing a person that millions of people knew intimately, whose face and voice and gestures were familiar to anyone who had seen the documentary or watched concert footage or simply listened to the music, and she had not attempted an impression. She had found, through whatever combination of research and instinct and craft, an emotional truth that was recognizably connected to Amy, without being a replica of her. Critics who otherwise despised the film went out of their way to say that her performance was not the problem. It was the writing and the framing and the decisions around her that had failed. She had also made the decision to sing the songs herself rather than lip-sync to Amy's recordings. This had been controversial before the film was released, and it remained controversial afterward. Some felt it was disrespectful, that Amy's voice was irreplaceable, and that any substitution was a diminishment. Others felt it was the only honest choice, that a performance could not be authentic if the central act of performing was outsourced to someone else. The debate was real and unresolved. What was not debated was the quality of Abela's singing, which was considerable, or the courage of the decision to attempt it at all.
Back to Black opened in the United Kingdom in April 2024 and in the United States in May 2025. Marisa Abella's performance as Amy was almost universally praised. She had done something genuinely difficult, inhabiting a person that millions of people knew intimately without attempting to impersonate her, finding the emotional truth of Amy's experience rather than the surface details. The film around the performance received the response that films receive when the audience believes it has been manipulated. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of disappointed recognition. The 38% on Rotten Tomatoes was not the score of a bad film. It was the score of a film that people felt had not told the truth. The Kapadia documentary, by contrast, had not been authorized. It had been made by someone who had no obligation to anyone in Amy's story, no access agreements to honor, no family relationships to protect, no estate permissions that might constrain what could be shown. Kapadia had assembled his picture from people who spoke freely, from footage that had been gathered without a narrative agenda, from the accumulated evidence of what had actually happened rather than what the surviving parties wished had happened. He had made the film that Amy's family did not want made, and it had won an Oscar. The Back to Black situation was not unique in the history of musical biopics. Bohemian Rhapsody, the Queen biopic made with the surviving band members' cooperation, had been criticized for sanitizing Freddie Mercury's story, softening the edges of his personal life and his relationship with the band in ways that the people who controlled the music had a commercial interest in softening. Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic made with John's own direct involvement as a producer, had been more honest, partly because John himself had decided honesty served him better than sanitization, and partly because the film's emotional core required the difficult material to work. Different estates, different decisions, different films. What Amy's case added to this pattern was a specific irony. The two films about her were not just different in quality or approach, they were in direct conflict about fundamental facts. One showed a father who discouraged her daughter's rehabilitation. One showed a father who supported it. Both could not be right. The audience, having seen both, was left to decide which version corresponded to what had actually happened. The answer, for most people who had watched both films carefully, was not difficult to arrive at. Amy had written the evidence. She had written it into a song. She had sung it in front of millions of people. My daddy thinks I'm fine, so I won't go, go, go. The contrast between the two films, 38% and 95%, the Mitch Winehouse Show and the Academy Award, raised a question that went beyond Amy Winehouse. It was the question that arises whenever a biographical film is made with the cooperation of the people it depicts. Who does that cooperation serve? The authorized version has access, locations, archives, the imprimatur of official approval. The unauthorized version has freedom, and freedom, it turns out, is what the truth tends to require. Mitch Winehouse said after Back to Black's release that there were lots of other things he wished they could have put in the film, but that it was only 2 hours long. He said it with the equanimity of a man who was broadly satisfied with what had been produced. He had spent 9 years pushing back against the Kapadia documentary. Now there was another film, one that told a different story about who he had been in his daughter's life, and it had been made with his blessing and shown in cinemas around the world. Amy was not alive to say which film she preferred, but the song she had written at 20, the one that said, "My daddy thinks I'm fine," was still there, still on the album, still saying what it had always said about the distance between how her father saw things and how she saw them. The authorized film showed a devoted father. The unauthorized film showed the line from Rehab. And between those two images, between the biopic that the family approved and the documentary that the family hated, is the space where the real story lives. It lives, as it always did, in the music, in the songs that Amy wrote from the inside of her own experience, with the honesty that nobody could authorize or edit or sanitize after the fact. The films will be debated, the Rotten Tomatoes scores will be cited, the question of who controls the legacy will remain unresolved, but the songs are still there, and they were never anyone's to control.